Hey folks, picture this. You step out of your sleek, climate-controlled loft onto a medieval alley where the air smells like a combination of horse sweat, rotting fish, and the lingering perfume of 100-year-old leather tannery. Yeah, it's basically a medieval version of a gym locker room after a marathon run. Before we dive any deeper, smash that like button if the thought of wandering through a scented time warp makes you grin, and drop a comment telling us the stinkiest modern place you've survived. Now dim the lights, pull a blanket over your shoulders, and let the flicker of a candle-lit screen transport you to an era where every street corner was a perfume test lab run by the gods of decay. You wake up to the clatter of blacksmiths hammering iron, the distant bleat of goats, and a gut-twisting whiff of human waste that drifts up from the open-air latrines like a bad corporate email you can't delete. The scent of fresh, baked rye mingles with the sour tang of spilled ale, and every breath feels like a reminder that medieval towns didn't have air fresheners. They had survived the odor as a daily reality. Think of it as swapping your city's traffic jam for a sensory overload where the only green space is a puddle of moldy rainwater reflecting a soot-blackened sky. So tell me, would you survive a day in that aromatic apocalypse? Aldrich stepped off the dusty cart and into Meyerford's Market Square, where stone walls caught the amber light of late afternoon, and the cobblestones radiated the warmth of a day spent in labor. The clang of blacksmith hammers blended with the low murmur of merchants arranging woven baskets, while the scent of fresh bread rose from a nearby stall, briefly masking the underlying heaviness. He noted the steady stream of townsfolk, women in wool skirts, children with soot-smudged cheeks, moving in quiet rhythm toward their daily chores. The air felt thick, as if the town itself exhaled a slow, lingering breath that carried whispers of river water turning sluggish near the open sewage channels. Aldrich's apprentice eyes traced the outlines of tanneries where hides hung like damp flags, already aware that such odors would soon become his teachers as well as his trade. By the time the sun slipped behind the town's low towers, the town crier's bell rang with a note that seemed to tremble in the stagnant air, announcing a foulness that had settled over Meyerford for weeks. He spoke of traders turning away, of children coughing as they played near the market, and of a merchant's ledger marked with dwindling numbers, each line a quiet accusation of the unseen rot. Aldrich felt the weight of the words settle onto his shoulders like a damp cloak, his skin prickling at the combined smells of rot, ash, and unwashed wool that now seemed more oppressive. The townspeople paused, their faces briefly furrowing before returning to their tasks, a collective sigh rising with the wind that struggled to carry any fresh scent. In that moment, the bustling square felt less like a lively hub and more like a chamber holding its breath, waiting for a remedy that had yet to appear. The crier, with a dry humor that matched the cracked stone, mentioned that the foulness behaved like a mischievous cat, appearing where least expected, yet never staying long enough to be caught. He gestured toward the tannery where apprentices scraped hides, noting that the pungent steam seemed to mock the very notion of cleanliness. Aldrich observed a baker wiping his hands on a flour-dusted apron, his smile half hidden beneath a puff of dough that rose like a reluctant sunrise, as if to suggest that even sweet bread could not wholly mask the town's perfume. Passers-by shook their heads at the irony of a place famed for its cloth and craft now being defined by an invisible cloud. The crier's voice lowered, his tone turning softer, as if the town itself were chuckling at its own inability to control the simple physics of waste and wind. Soon, a group of seasoned townsfolk gathered around the well, their hands moving in practiced motions to stir the water, while chanting an old rhyme that spoke of clearing the streets and closing the latrines at night. Aldrich watched as a handful of women carried wooden buckets, their shoulders bearing the weight of both water and responsibility, each splash echoing like a gentle metronome against stone. The blacksmith, wiping sweat from his brow, offered to forge a simple iron grate for the drainage, his steady hammer providing a rhythm that seemed to coax the air into a calmer cadence. Children, now quiet, sat on the steps of the tavern, their eyes half closed, as if the evening's hush encouraged a brief respite from the oppressive smell. By twilight, a faint coolness drifted from the river, mixing with the lingering aromas and granting the market a tentative sense of equilibrium. As night settled over Meyerford, Aldrich lingered on the square's edge, feeling the subtle shift from tension to a muted acceptance that the town, like all human endeavors, carried its imperfections like a quiet coat. He reflected on how the collective effort to address the foulness revealed a patience woven through daily life, a reminder that even the most stubborn odors could be softened by shared labor and humble humor. The faint glow of lanterns painted the cobbles in soft amber, casting long shadows where the day's smells lingered but no longer dominated. In that stillness, Aldrich sensed the town's resilience, a slow, breathing rhythm that matched the pulse of history itself, steady, unhurried, and ever-present. The experience taught him that the true fragrance of a medieval town lay not in the absence of stench, but in the measured grace with which its people endured and soothed their world. At dawn, Aldrich, a lanky apprentice cobbler, found himself lingering near the market square, where the air hung thick with the scent of damp wool and unwashed bodies. he met Myra, the miller's daughter, whose hair was tucked beneath a soot-stained headscarf and whose eyes flickered with a quiet curiosity. Their conversation began with the clatter of wooden carts and the faint crack of river water as the mill turned. Myra mentioned that the smell seemed to gather near the old stone well at the edge of the lane. Aldrich listened, feeling the cool cobblestones under his boots and the weight of the town's breath on his skin. The scene felt ordinary, yet carried an invisible thread of inquiry. As they approached the well, a sour vapor rose from its dark mouth, tinged with the metallic hint of iron and the sourness of stale urine. The narrow alleys behind the well narrowed further, their walls plastered with cracked lime that peeled away like tired skin. Myra led Aldrich past a row of overflowing privies, where the stench of human waste mingled with the sour odor of rotting vegetables from recent market stalls. The sound of a distant carpenter's hammer reverberated faintly, barely breaking the oppressive silence. Both felt the heat of the midday sun on their shoulders, yet a cold draught slipped out of the well, curling around their ankles. The growing awareness that something hidden beneath the stone might be breathing out the foul air tightened the air between them. Villagers whispered that a cursed relic, an iron cross once sealed beneath the well, was the source of the noxious vapors, their faces blurred by the dimness of the well's shadow. Myra chuckled softly, noting that the real culprit seemed more mundane than any saintly curse, perhaps the neglected privy runoff that seeped into the well's masonry. As Aldrich brushed away a layer of moss, a faint ripple of water hinted at stagnant pools that had collected discarded scraps and ash. The irony of a supposed holy object being blamed for a very earthly foulness drifted through the alley like a lazy breeze. Their steps echoed against the stone, a rhythm that matched the slow churn of the mill's wheel beyond. The realization settled like dust, quieting the earlier alarm with a gentle hum of human oversight. The sun sank, painting the terracotta roofs with amber, and the town's rhythm slowed as shopkeepers lowered their shutters, and the miller's apprentice swayed a sack of grain onto the ground. In the fading light, the smell around the well softened, diluted by the cooler evening air that brushed over the stone and carried away the lingering foulness. Aldrich and Myra stood quiet, watching a mother coax a child past the well, the child's small hand gripping a wooden toy, while the mother's breath was steady and unhurried. The distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer now sounded like a lullaby, resonating with the gentle rustle of hay in the wind. Their conversation drifted to simple matters: bread, the upcoming harvest, the texture of fresh flour, while the stone well rested in a calm hush. The town's pulse, though still marked by smell, seemed to settle into a patient, sleepy cadence. Later, as lanterns flickered against the stone walls, Aldrich reflected on the day's quiet investigation, recognizing how the town's imperfections were woven into its very foundations. He thought of Myra's soft smile, the way her hands brushed dust from ancient bricks, and how those small gestures kept the communal space alive despite its flaws. The well, now a hushed silhouette, stood as a reminder that history often hides its most pungent truths beneath ordinary stone. Aldrich felt a gentle gratitude for the unnoticed labor of those who emptied privies, tended the mill, and mended shoes, for they were the true keepers of the town's breath. In the stillness, he understood that the scent of a place is not merely a nuisance, but a ledger of lived moments, each exhalation recording human frailty and perseverance. With that quiet acknowledgement, he slipped back into the cobbler's shop, the soft click of the door marking another unremarkable yet meaningful day. Aldrich and Myra lowered themselves into the stone well that still whispered of centuries of rainwater and forgotten footsteps. The narrow shaft was dim, the air heavy with damp earth, and a faint hint of stale cheese that clung to the stone walls. Their lanterns threw shaky pools of amber light that slipped over the rough plaster, revealing graffiti scratched by anonymous hands. Above them, the market town's cobbles echoed with distant chatter, while below the well they felt an almost palpable pause in time. They exchanged a quiet smile, aware that the darkness below held the quiet stories of the town's most routine, yet unseen labor. Deeper still, they uncovered a concealed chamber where bundles of animal hides lay stacked like sleeping cats, their leather slick with old blood. Beside them, crumbling barrels of rotting food waste leaked a sour stink that seemed to fight the scent of the earth. A rusted plaque marked the space as the Old Guild of Waste, a forgotten collective that had once sealed the refuse to protect the city streets. As Myra brushed aside a pile, the ceiling above gave a low groan, and a slab of stone collapsed, sending dust and small stones swirling around their feet. The sudden darkness tightened around them, and the echo of their own breathing became the only sound in the cramped tomb. It was oddly ironic that the guild's diligent effort to hide waste now amplified the very odor they had tried to contain. The hides, meant to be cured and used for leather, were left to rot, turning the chamber into a slow brewing perfume of decay. The town's mayor had once praised the guild as the guardian of civic hygiene, yet the sealed cavity now smelled stronger than the market's open stalls. Myra's lantern flickered, casting long shadows that made the stone look like the blurred faces of past officials, forever turned away from this foul secret. Their tension softened as they recognized the quiet absurdity of human plans that, when buried, become only another layer of the town's lingering perfume. Aldrich reached into his satchel and produced a bundle of dried lavender and rosemary, herbs he had gathered for a modest apothecary stall. He crushed the leaves between his fingers, releasing a gentle, cooling scent that mingled with the dank air like a soft exhale. With a small iron bowl, he heated the herbs over the faint ember of his lantern, coaxing a thin veil of incense to rise and settle over the stones. The fragrant smoke wrapped the cramped space in a calm blanket, easing the sharp edge of the rot and quieting their startled hearts. As the incense swirled, Myra's breath steadied, and together they traced the faint outline of an exit, their steps now guided by a steady, scented rhythm. When they finally emerged into the twilight of the town square, the air outside felt cooler, scented with the distant bake of bread and the faint echo of church bells. The well's hidden chamber remained unseen by most, a reminder that townsfolk of the past often solved problems with stone walls, while the scent of their deeds lingered beneath. Aldrich slipped the remaining herbs back into his satchel, pondering how a simple blend of plant and patience could calm both body and memory. Myra brushed a stray cobblestone from her skirt, noting that the town's ordinary bustle continued, oblivious to the secret perfumed tunnel below. In the soft glow of the setting sun, they shared a quiet acknowledgement that history, much like the well, holds both the concealed messes and the gentle breaths that help us endure them. In the cool dusk of a river-touched market town, Aldrich slipped from the low wooden well where he had hidden his satchel of water buckets. The stone walls still damp from the day's heat. The narrow lanes smelled of tanned leather, spilled ale, and the ever-present rot of refuse piled beside the tavern, a pungency that clung to the evening air like a heavy shawl. He paused, hearing the distant clatter of a blacksmith's hammer and the sigh of a woman sweeping ashes from her doorway. Each sound a reminder of ordinary life persisting amid the odor. With careful steps, Aldrich reached the council hall, its oaken doors creaking as if uneasy about the night to come. He lifted his voice, low and measured, proposing a coordinated burn of the waste piles, guarded by fire-resistant clay barriers and the town's modest rain-collected reservoirs. The councilmen shuffled, their robes rustling, eyes flickering like candle flames as they weighed the suggestion against the risk of uncontrolled fire. A murmured objection rose from the youngest member, noting the recent drought that had left the thatch roofs parched and the streets cracked, making any blaze a perilous gamble. Aldrich felt the weight of their hesitation settle like the thickened mist that began to roll from the river. Yet he pressed on, describing how the barriers would be layered with sand and wet wool, and how the stored water could be poured in steady streams to tame any errant spark. The tension rose with each exchange, the council's wooden benches scraping softly against the stone floor as they leaned forward, the ambient scent of decay growing sharper as the fire-ready piles glowed faintly in the lantern light. The atmosphere held a quiet urgency, a moment where the town's stifling breath seemed poised to be replaced by the crackle of purposeful flame. When the council finally consented, a thin smile flickered on Aldrich's face, as if amused by the irony of cleansing the town with the very element that could destroy it. He watched the night workers, their faces half-shadowed, load the refuse onto a modest pyre, arranging the clay barriers with the steady precision of a mason laying brick. The first spark caught the dry twine, and a small orange tongue licked the sky, rising above the rooftops, while the townsfolk paused their evening chores to watch. A collective sigh drifting from their throats like a soft exhale. The flames danced, consuming the waste in a controlled blaze, the heat radiating outward, briefly warming the chilled stone walls, and momentarily dispersing the foul odor that had clung to every corner. In the glow, the council members exchanged glances, the tension easing into a muted chuckle, acknowledging that their solution was as precarious as it was practical. As the fire waned, the ash settled into a fine gray carpet, and the river's cool breeze began to carry away the lingering scent of char and former rot, leaving behind a cleaner, though still humble, night air. The townspeople returned to their homes, the low murmur of doors closing and shutters being drawn a gentle soundtrack to the renewed tranquility. Aldrich stood near the well, feeling the damp stone under his fingertips, the water in his buckets, now a quiet reservoir of calm rather than a weapon. The council gathered around the fading embers, their voices low, discussing the modest success of the night's effort, while the soft glow painted their faces with a faint amber hue. The evening settled into a steady rhythm, the town breathing easier, the usual clatter of daily chores resuming with a slightly lighter step. Later, beneath the pale glow of a waning moon, Aldrich reflected on the night's fragile balance between danger and remedy, noting how the town's stubbornness had yielded to a simple, collective act of cleansing. He sensed a quiet lesson in the way the fire had transformed the oppressive stench into a memory, reminding the townsfolk that even the most ingrained discomforts could be addressed with patient cooperation. The river whispered nearby, its steady flow echoing the steady pulse of life that persisted despite the lingering shadows of past odors. In the calm that followed, the council's decisions seemed less a decree of authority and more a shared acknowledgement of human frailty and resilience. Aldrich's thoughts drifted like the soft smoke that rose one last time, a reminder that history, much like a tired sigh, moves forward with measured, unhurried steps. When the first light brushed the stone walls of Meyerford, the air hung heavy with the mingled scents of damp clay, animal waste, and the faint sourness of tallow. Aldrich, the young master mason, stood near the western gate, feeling the stickiness of the morning mist on his skin as he surveyed the clogged gutters. The townsfolk shuffled past the market stalls, their cloaks damp, eyes lowered, as the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer seemed to echo within the smog. Children tugged at their mothers' skirts, eyes wide, but their breaths were shallow from the lingering odor that clung to every cobblestone. In the tavern, the hearth crackled, sending thin ribbons of smoke that barely lifted the oppressive smell, while a weary brewer whispered of a plan to clear the waste. The day began with a collective resolve, quiet as the sunrise, that something must change. By midday, the town's main ditch, once a bustling conduit for runoff, had become a stagnant pool, thick with froth and debris, its surface reflecting the sun like a greasy mirror. Aldrich gathered a group of laborers, their hands calloused, their tools clinking as they pushed wooden carts laden with muck toward the river bank. The sound of shovels striking damp earth reverberated through the narrow lanes, while the lingering stench grew sharper, pressing against the throat of each passerby. Near the forge, the blacksmith's fire sputtered, battling the humid air that seemed to swallow the flames, and a young apprentice paused, wiping sweat from his brow, aware that the heat was now a thin veil over the rising tension. As the waste was heaved into the cart, a sudden downpour turned the street into a slick of mud, sending the filth spilling onto the market stalls and staining fresh bread with droplets of foul water. The town held its breath, feeling the weight of failure and the promise of a harder effort ahead. Evening approached, and with the rain subsiding, the clogged ditch finally yielded a rush of water that carried away much of the accumulated grime, revealing the pale stones beneath like a sigh of relief. The townspeople stood at the river's edge, watching the current whisk away the blackened sludge, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of torches that flickered against the now clearer sky. Ironically, as the air cleared, the market's aroma shifted from the sour tang of waste to the warm, inviting scent of simmering pottage and fresh rye bread, drawing a few lingering shoppers back to the stalls. Aldrich, wiping soot from his cheek, felt a modest pride as children laughed, their voices lighter, while the distant church bells rang, their sound unburdened by the earlier heaviness, yet the same breeze that carried the pleasant odors also lifted a faint trace of the day's effort, reminding all that the improvement was fragile, perched on the edge of ordinary labor. In this quiet reversal, the town sensed both triumph and the absurdity of how a simple flow of water could rewrite the day's mood. The night settled over Meyerford like a soft blanket, the terracotta roofs absorbing the last ember of sunlight, while the streets glistened with a thin film of residual rain. Lanterns swayed gently, casting amber circles on the cobblestones, where an elderly woman paused to tie her shawl, feeling the coolness of the stone beneath her fingertips. A distant murmur of conversation drifted from the inn, where patrons exchanged low jokes about the day's grime, their laughter barely stirring the still air. Aldrich walked home, the wooden handle of his tools resting against his shoulder, the weight of the day's work balanced by the ease of his steps on the now dry path. The town's scent had settled into a subtle mixture of damp earth and faint smoke, a reminder that while the worst had passed, the environment remained a tapestry woven from countless small irritations. In this tranquil pause, the ordinary rhythms of daily life resumed, undramatic yet comforting. In the quiet of his courtyard, the apprentice sat on a low bench, tracing the patterns of moss on the stone wall, contemplating how layers of sewage, leather tanning, and open hearths had once merged into a single oppressive fog. He imagined future generations watching the same streets, perhaps unaware of the unseen labor that had coaxed fresh air back into their world, and felt a modest humility in that continuity. The lesson lingered like the faint, lingering scent of the day's work. That human imperfection, when met with patient ingenuity, can be eased, but never wholly erased. As the night deepened, a soft hoot of an owl punctuated the stillness, echoing the slow, patient heartbeat of the town itself. Aldrich's ingenuity, the collective effort, and the subtle irony of a single watercourse reminded the apprentice that progress often arrives on the back of ordinary hands, and that history, like breath, inhales and exhales in measured, unhurried cycles, with a sigh that blended relief and resignation. He rose, carrying the calm understanding of how even the smallest change can shift the scent of a whole community. In Aldemer, the narrow thoroughfare between the market stalls and the town hall is lined with stone gutters that catch rainwater, and the steady stream of waste from communal latrines. Master Mason Tomas inspects the worn limestone arches, noting the way the water glistens on the cobbles in the late afternoon light. Merchant Lena balances a basket of dried figs, listening to the soft clatter of wooden wheels over the uneven stones. Brother Edric walks beside them, his habit brushing against the cool, damp edge of the gutter, as he pauses to watch a child splash a puddle with a wooden spoon. The city breathes a muted rhythm, each footstep echoing the unseen flow beneath the cobbles. When a sudden summer storm swells the gutters, the water rushes faster, mixing with the inevitable runoff from the latrines, and turning the stone lanes into slick corridors of murky flow. Tomas feels the sudden chill on his hands as he steadies a stone, while Lena's figs become slick and threatened by the rising tide. The smell of earth and waste sharpens, pressing against the street lamp's flickering glow, and a few townsfolk hurry past, their cloaks clinging to their skin. Brother Edric watches a stray dog step into the water, its paws sending ripples that disturb a nearby pile of fresh ash. The city feels a brief tightening, as if the very foundations are testing the patience of those who walk above them. Yet within the chaos, an unexpected market emerges. A woman selling warm bread sets a wooden stall right at the water's edge, the steam rising like a quiet promise. Lena laughs, trading a fig for the bread, noting how the shared inconvenience draws strangers together in brief, polite conversation about the water's rise. Tomas, wiping his wet palms, remarks that the stone arches, though built for stability, now serve as a stage for these small exchanges, their purpose expanding beyond mere support. Even Brother Edric pauses to listen, his eyes softening as he hears a child's giggle as a dropped spoon skims the surface, creating a tiny ripple that reflects the lantern light. The irony settles like a gentle hush, reminding all that even the most utilitarian channels can become conduits for camaraderie. When the storm fades, the water recedes, leaving a thin sheen on the stone that catches the amber glow of evening lamps. Tomas places the final chisel on his workbench, the metal cool against his palm, and feels a quiet satisfaction in the way the gutters have held their course. Lena returns to her stall, arranging figs in neat piles, her breath steady as the night air carries a faint, lingering scent of rain-soaked earth. Brother Edric settles on a low bench beside the latrine, the stone cool beneath him, and watches the city settle into a slower pulse, the distant clink of a blacksmith's hammer echoing softly. The open sewers, now calm, continue their invisible labor, a silent infrastructure that lets the city's daily life flow without fanfare. In the quiet after dusk, each resident of Aldemer finds a small comfort in the constancy of the stone gutters and communal latrines, recognizing how the unseen channels shape more than just waste removal. Tomas reflects on how his craft, though measured in meters of stone, supports the fragile balance of human exchange beneath the streets. Lena, after counting the day's modest earnings, feels gratitude for the simple rhythm that allows her market to thrive, despite the ever-present scent of the sewers. Brother Edric, eyes half closed, senses the city's breath sinking with the slow drip from the gutters. A reminder that civilization rests upon humble, often ignored foundations. The story ends with a soft acknowledgement that, beneath the cobblestones, the modest flow of water and waste quietly architects the very fabric of communal life. In the early light of spring, the market quarter of Veltford lay under a thin veil of mist that rose from the open stone channels threading between stalls. The channels, known locally as the open sewers, carried runoff and refuse in a slow, murky flow that reflected the cracked cobbles. Lena, a weaver whose loom sang beside the bakery, watched the water glint as merchants unloaded barrels of grain, while the scent of damp earth lingered on the breeze. Children chased each other along the narrow lanes, their feet splashing in the shallow puddles that collected after the night rain. The city council, seated in a modest stone hall nearby, kept a quiet ledger of taxes, barely noting the constant churn of waste beneath their feet. By midsummer, a fevered cough began to ripple through the traders, and the scent of illness seemed to mingle with the ever-present musk of the sewers. Voices rose from the market stalls as the townsfolk whispered that the foul waters had turned hostile, blaming the open channels for the sudden wave of sickness. Guild leaders gathered on the wooden benches of the council yard, raising sharp fists toward the flowing ditch, while pointing accusing fingers at one another. Tomas, foreman of the blacksmiths, clutched a wooden shield of concern for his apprentices, fearing that the damp air would weaken iron as it had their health. The council clerk recorded each complaint in a notebook, his quill scratching a steady rhythm that matched the uneasy pulse of the crowd. Amid the heated exchange, a subtle irony rippled beneath the clamor. The very guilds that decried the sewers were the ones who dumped ash, offcuts, and brine into the same open veins during their daily work. Lena, whose linen dyed in bright ochre, recalled how her apprentices would dump leftover dye vats into the channels, watching the colors bleed downstream. The council members, wrapped in woolen cloaks, sighed as they inspected the water, noting that the murk was not only waste, but also the hue of their own crafts. Tomas, though voicing concern for his workers, shrugged when a stray hammer fell into the ditch, the clang echoing like a reluctant confession. The market's hum settled into a muted murmur as each participant sensed the shared responsibility that lay hidden beneath the surface. When night fell, the council convened in the dim lantern light of the hall, the air cooler, and the sewers now a quiet, sluggish ribbon beneath the stone arches. A senior mason suggested a simple stone grate to cover the most turbulent stretch, while a herbalist proposed planting willow reeds, whose roots might filter the runoff. Lena offered to donate a portion of her woven cloth to line the new barriers, and Tomas promised to reroute the smithy's slag away from the main flow. The discussion unfolded with measured breaths, each proposal weighed against the lingering chill of the evening wind. In the end, a modest plan emerged, an alternating schedule of weekly cleanings, modest barriers, and a communal pledge to keep the channels clear, accepted with calm nods and the soft rustle of parchment. Weeks later, the market returned to its steady rhythm, the scent of the sewers still present, but softened by the faint perfume of willow and the occasional sparkle of reflected lantern light. Lena's weavings hung above the newly graded section, their patterns catching the amber glow and reminding passers-by of the quiet labor behind the city's pulse. Tomas watched his apprentices wipe sweat from their brows, their hands steadier now that the water's edge felt less treacherous. The council's ledger recorded fewer complaints, and the lingering stench became a background hum rather than a scream. In the stillness between the clatter of carts and the low murmur of conversation, the townspeople sensed a gentle lesson that ordinary neglect can brew discord, yet modest, shared effort can steady the flow of everyday life. The early morning light spills over the low walls of Aldenford, where the street gutters run open like shallow riverbeds. Waste and rain mingle, a sluggish brown ribbon that the town's children skirt around while chasing a tossed stone. The scent of damp earth and lingering urine rises from the stone arches, and the clatter of wooden carts punctuates the still air. Vendors set up stalls beside the channels, their fabrics rustling as they arrange cheese and coarse bread. In this ordinary chorus, the open sewers are as much a part of daily rhythm as the bell that tolls from the tower. When the council drafted plans to cover the gutters with stone slabs, the Masons' Guild gathered beneath the Guildhall's eaves, voices low but steady. They whispered of lost commissions, feeling the cold iron of their tools grow idle as the stone would be set by royal craftsmen instead. The sound of hammers that once rang on fresh blocks now faded into an uneasy hush, and the scent of fresh mortar seemed a distant promise. Their leaders raised wooden tablets, each etched with the cost of labor, and the clerk's quill scratched a hesitant acceptance. Yet the guild's hesitation lingered, a thin layer of dust over the ambition to smooth the streets. The clergy, cloaked in wool, entered the debate with a different reverence, their faces blurred by the dim candlelight of the chapter house. They argued that the open latrines reminded the faithful of humility, a tactile reminder of the earth's inevitable return. The soft murmur of prayers blended with the distant splash of water, creating a paradox where sanctity and filth shared the same stone. Their words carried the weight of centuries, yet the practical clatter of stone being lifted from the ground still echoed in the courtyard. The irony lay in their desire to preserve the humble pit, while the city's merchants complained of the lingering odor that clung to their woolen sleeves. Brother Edric, whose habit was as plain as the river stones, stepped between the two factions on a rain-slick cobblestone. He listened to the masons' concerns, feeling the rough texture of their calloused palms, and to the clergy's pleas, noting the cool draft that curled around the chapter's arches. With a measured tone, he proposed covered channels that would still showcase the guild's craftsmanship, allowing masons to carve modest reliefs that echoed scriptural vines. At the same time, he suggested latrines built of brick and timber, set back from the bustling lanes, preserving the humble humility the clergy cherished while limiting the foul vapors. The agreement was drafted on parchment that smelled of ink and damp stone. And as the sun waned, both sides placed a single stone upon the table, sealing the compromise. Later that evening, the first slab was lowered, its cool surface touching the wet earth, and the city inhaled a quieter breath. In the months that followed, the covered sewers collected rain in a subdued murmur, their stone surfaces warm under the afternoon sun. The new latrines, modest and tucked behind the baker's courtyard, released only a faint plume that rose like a sigh above the market stalls. Citizens adjusted their routes, the children no longer darting around the open channels, but pausing to watch the slow glide of water beneath the slabs. The masons found pride in the subtle carvings, while the clergy noticed the unchanged reverence within the quiet corners of the new facilities. Over time, the city's rhythm settled into a softer cadence, a reminder that even the most stubborn traditions can be reshaped, not by force, but by a gentle touch that respects both stone and spirit. In the low summer heat, the market lane of the town lay beside a shallow trench that served as both drainage and latrine, its stone edges worn smooth by countless carts. Merchants set up their stalls of dried figs and coarse cloth, their voices mingling with the occasional splash of water that seeped from the open channel after a brief rain. Children darted between barrels, their bare feet feeling the cool, damp earth that smelled faintly of ash and urine. The council's clerk recorded the modest tax on each stall, while the city's watchman swept away stray leaves, unaware of any looming threat beyond the ordinary rhythm. Even the baker, wiping flour from his hands, paused to glance at the sluggish current, noting how it carried away small debris like a patient beast. Life moved with a measured sigh, as if the town itself were breathing slowly against the backdrop of stone and mud. One afternoon, dark clouds gathered over the hill, and the wind began to sigh through the narrow alleys, stirring dust from the cobbles. The rain arrived in sudden sheets, striking the open trench with a force that turned its lazy trickle into a roar. Hammering against the wooden planks of the stalls, water rose quickly, turning the channel into a dark river that lapped at the legs of the townsfolk, chilling their skin and soaking their wares. The scent of wet earth mixed with the sharper tang of waste, creating a heavy atmosphere that settled like a low fog over the market. Vendors clutched their goods, their faces a study in quiet resignation, as the flood edged closer to the stalls of spices and pottery. The council's meeting hall, perched on higher ground, listened to the patter of water against its stone walls, its members exchanging glances that hinted at growing unease. Within minutes, the swollen water breached the makeshift barriers, sweeping away crates of grain and scattering the colorful fabrics into a chaotic tide that reflected the stormy sky. A stray ember from the baker's oven, tossed by a gust, landed upon the damp thatch of a nearby stall, igniting a small fire that crackled against the roar of water, a strange duet of heat and wetness. The flames licked the wet cloth, sending plumes of steam and smoke upward, while townspeople stood in stunned silence, their cries muffled by the constant rush of water. The council, observing from the safety of stone arches, debated the cause with a languid tone, their deliberations sliding like the water itself, some arguing for immediate repair, others for the cost of new stone conduits. The irony lay in the fact that the very channels meant to carry away waste now carried the town's commerce away in a single, unstoppable surge. As the fire dimmed under the wetness, the flood pressed on, erasing the familiar layout of the marketplace in a quiet, relentless sweep. When the storm finally waned, a thin mist lingered over the empty squares, and the water receded to a sluggish murmur that barely touched the remaining stones. The market lay in disarray, stalls shattered, their timber splintered. Yet a soft hush settled as survivors gathered to count what remained, their hands moving slowly over charred fabrics and soaked grain. The council convened in the open courtyard, their chairs scraped against damp earth, voices low and measured as they examined the damage without haste. Lanterns were lit, casting amber circles on wet cobbles, and a quiet resolve settled among the townsfolk, as if the night itself were coaxing them toward patient repair. The fire's ash settled into the soil, mixing with the sludge, a muted reminder of the night's chaos, now softened by the cool night air. In the weeks that followed, craftsmen lowered new stone arches over the former trench, sealing it with careful mortar that smelled of lime and earth, while workers installed wooden grates to allow rain to filter without flooding. The council, now more aware of the fragile balance between waste and water, drafted ordinances that required regular cleaning of the concealed channels, a habit that felt both tedious and necessary. Children returned to the market lane, their footsteps lighter on the repaired ground, the scent of fresh bread and clean water mingling in a way that felt newly earned. Older residents watched the changes with a quiet acceptance, noting how the city's slow adaptation mirrored the patient growth of the vines that clung to the walls. Though the memory of the flood lingered like a faint aftertaste, the town settled into a rhythm that honored both its imperfections and its capacity for gentle correction. In the soft glow of evening, the city exhaled, carrying forward the lesson that even the most ordinary systems, when ignored, can swell into brief, unsettling torrents, yet also can be steadied by deliberate, quiet hands. When the first stone arches rose over Aldermer's narrow lanes, the air seemed to hold its breath, listening to the soft clink of chisels against limestone. Tomas, the city mason, walked the dust-laden streets with a steady gaze, his hands feeling the cool humidity of the newly opened channels. The townsfolk gathered at the market square, watching the workers lay the curved bricks that would soon carry away the unseen stream of daily waste. Children paused their games, eyes lingering on the shadowed interior of the vaults, as if a secret were being unburied. In that quiet moment, the promise of a cleaner city settled like a gentle dusk over the rooftops. Yet the transition was not without a subtle unease. The scent of earth and damp stone lingered longer than the townspeople were accustomed to. Lena, whose stalls sold fragrant herbs, felt the faint chill of moisture seeping through the cobbles, and she tightened the shutters on her shop. Rumors whispered through the alleys about the sudden change in the river's flow, and a few elders muttered that the old ways of open ditches had kept the city honest. Tomas received a weary sigh from a laborer whose shoulder bruised against a freshly placed keystone, a reminder that progress always demands a small sacrifice. The city swayed between anticipation and the weight of its own habits, a gentle tension humming beneath the evening bells. Irony settled in like a soft chuckle as the waste that once stained the streets now traveled in hidden arches beneath the foot traffic. The latrines, carved from smooth stone, offered a quiet place for the townsfolk to relieve themselves, and the scent that rose from them was taken away by the vaulted sewers with the same discretion they offered to the citizens. Lena noticed that the market scent of fresh produce lingered longer, no longer masked by the stale odor of runoff, and customers lingered to linger a moment more. Tomas, watching his arches glitter with with the faint reflection of lantern light, realized that the unseen currents had become the city's new rhythm, shaping commerce as surely as any trade route. In the soft glow of torches, the city learned that the invisible pathways could dictate the visible flow of daily life. As weeks turned into months, a calm steadied Aldemer. The streets echoed with the lighter tread of traders, whose wares no longer clung to the sourness of stagnant water. The market thrummed with a brighter chorus of voices, and Lena's stalls filled with brighter spices, their colors vivid against the cream-colored walls of the newly built latrines. Tomas found quiet pride in the way his arches stood firm, their stone cool to the touch during the midday heat, a testament to patient hands and steady breath. Children ran past the stone vaults, their laughter bouncing off the walls, unaware of the engineering that kept their breath sweet. The city's pulse settled into a measured rhythm, each day passing with the soft sigh of water disappearing into the earth, a subtle reminder of order restored. In the evening, Brother Edric recorded the transformation in his vellum, his quill moving over the page with a measured, almost sleepy precision. He noted how the hidden streams of waste had cleared the visible pathways of commerce, and how the humble stonework brought a shared sense of honor among the citizens. Tomas read the chronicle and felt a modest warmth in his chest, knowing his designs were more than stone. They were the scaffolding of communal trust. Lena, after closing her stall, paused to watch the lanterns flicker over the vaulted sewers, feeling a quiet gratitude for the steadier breath of the city. The monk's final entry warned gently that civilization's progress often rides upon the unnoticed currents beneath our feet, a calm moral that lingered like the scent of fresh bread in the night air. When the first banner of the town square was hoisted, Mayor Aldrich walked the cobbles with a measured stride, his hand tapping the wooden pole that summoned shepherds from the distant hills. In the pale morning light, wool-clad merchants arrived on creaking carts, their wares stacked like quiet hills of fabric. Children, cheeks flushed with excitement, slipped through the alleys, their laughter echoing against stone walls as they chased a timid goat that had slipped free from its keeper. The air carried a faint, earthy scent of damp hay, a promise of the bustling day that lay ahead. The town's rhythm, slow as a ticking clock, began its gentle swell with each footfall on the uneven street. Soon the streets grew dense with the steady clatter of hooves and the low murmurs of bargaining voices, while the smell of raw livestock rose, thickening like a fog that settled over the market stalls. The goats, now a small herd, nudged against wooden benches, their musk mingling with the warm breath of the sun-baked stone. Merchants adjusted their caps, wiping sweat from foreheads as they haggled over bolts of linen, their eyes flickering between the wares and the swaying heads of the animals. Children, undeterred, darted between legs, their small hands grasping at stray tufts of wool that fluttered like soft clouds. The tension lay not in anger, but in the quiet endurance of a town accustomed to sharing its narrow lanes with both commerce and creature. Amid the mingled aromas of fresh cheese and barnyard perfume, a subtle irony unfolded. The very smells that threatened to overwhelm also seemed to draw a soft smile from the crowd. An elderly weaver, her fingers stained with dye, paused to inhale the pungent breeze and remarked, with a half-laugh, that the market smelled of prosperity's own sweat. A mischievous goat, oblivious to the conversation, nudged a merchant's cloak, scattering a few stray threads that fluttered like fallen leaves. The traders, accustomed to the occasional disruption, simply adjusted their stalls, their patience as steady as the town's ancient stone foundations. In this shared moment of gentle absurdity, the market's pulse beat on, unperturbed by the fragrant chaos. As the sun slipped toward the western hills, a warm amber hue settled over Brindlewick, and the clamor softened into a quiet hum. The goats, now content, rested in the shade of a timbered awning, their breaths slow and rhythmic, while the scent of their presence mellowed into a familiar background note. Merchants settled onto benches, sipping thin broth, their eyes watching the slow drift of clouds above the thatched roofs. Children, weary from their games, gathered near a fountain, their small hands cupping the cool water that reflected the town's stonework. The streets, still lined with stalls, seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The earlier uproar now, a memory folded into the day's gentle cadence. When the market finally drew to a close, the townsfolk gathered their carts and coaxed the last of the livestock back toward the hills. The evening's chill wrapping around their shoulders like a soft blanket. Aldrich lingered at the gate, his gaze lingering on the empty square, and reflected on how the simple act of gathering amid smells, chatter, and occasional mishaps wove a thread of continuity through generations. He thought of the goat's playful nudge, the children's laughter, and the steady hands that counted coins, each a quiet testament to human perseverance. In the fading light, the lingering aroma of earth and wool lingered not as a burden, but as a reminder of shared labor and modest joy. The town settled into night, its stones still holding the faint echo of a day when ordinary lives converged, fragrant and unassuming, beneath a tired sky. When the first pale light brushed the cobbles, the town square began to fill with the clatter of wooden carts and the low murmur of traders arranging their stalls. A handful of sheep, their wool still damp from the morning mist, were shepherded into the narrow lane that curved between the baker's shop and the blacksmith's forge. The air, already cool, acquired the faint bite of fresh earth as hooves pressed into the stones, stirring up dust that settled like a thin veil over the facades. Women in faded aprons lifted the shutters of their windows, curious about the day's promise, while the town's clock told a measured beat. In that slow, deliberate opening, the market seemed a living tableau, poised between routine and the subtle stir of anticipation. Soon the lane grew crowded, and the scent of manure rose, mixing with the sour sweat of laborers and the spilled ale that pooled near the tavern stall. The baker's wife, her hands still dusted with flour, leaned out to voice a quiet protest, noting how the odor gnawed at the rising crust of her breads. At the same time, the butchers, their knives glinting, argued with the wool traders over the narrow stretch of ground where ventilation was poorest, each claiming a right to the fresher breeze. Voices rose in measured cadence, not shouted, as the market's rhythm tightened like a rope being drawn taut. The tension lingered in the steam from the nearby hot water vats, a thin ribbon that seemed to bind the competing parties together. Amid the polite squabbles, a small irony unfolded. The very wool that the traders prized for its warmth now swayed in the wind, stirring the same dust that threatened the butcher's cured meats. A child, oblivious to the dispute, tugged at his mother's skirt and asked why the air smelled like the farmyard, prompting a weary chuckle from the nearby ale cellar. The butchers, spotting the child's curiosity, offered a slice of smoked ham, its rich aroma briefly silencing the argument as noses turned toward the savory scent. The wool traders, in turn, draped a bundle of freshly sheared fleece over a bench, its soft texture catching the fading light and inviting a brief pause in the clamor. The scene settled into a quiet tableau of shared humanity, where commerce and complaint brushed shoulders like old acquaintances. As the sun dipped toward the western wall, the market's pulse softened, carts settled, and the crowd thinned to a rhythm of measured steps. The lingering smell of manure, now mellowed by the cool evening air, merged with the sweet caramel of the pastry stall and the faint resin of wooden barrels. The baker's wife, now seated on a stoop, watched the last shepherd guide his flock away, the wool bundles folding neatly against the stone. The butchers cleaned their knives with a careful swipe, the metallic clang echoing faintly, while the wool traders folded their cloths, their faces bearing the gentle fatigue of a day's labor. In that quiet closing, the square exhaled, the combined scents lingering like a memory that would dissolve at dawn. When the final bell rang, the town's streets lay quiet, the cobbles retaining the imprint of hooves and the faint, lingering perfume of the day's commerce. Residents retreated to their homes, carrying with them the faint reminder that even the most disagreeable odors are woven into the fabric of shared existence. The market, now empty, seemed to rest under a blanket of twilight, its stalls awaiting the next cycle of purpose and perfume. History, ever patient, observed this modest episode with a soft smile, noting how the mingling of sweat, manure, and barley beer revealed the ordinary resilience of townsfolk. In the stillness, a gentle lesson lingered. That coexistence is often a balance of fragrances, each tolerable only when accepted with quiet humility. At the break of market day, the town's narrow lanes filled with the measured clatter of wooden carts and the soft rustle of woolen cloaks. Shepherds guided their flocks along the cobbles, the sheep's damp fur catching the morning light and releasing a faint, earthy musk that hovered over stalls of dried herbs. Vendors arranged baskets of root vegetables, while the faint squeal of a piglet slipped through the chatter, unnoticed amid the routine barter. The air held a gentle promise, a quiet anticipation that commerce and livestock could coexist without disturbance. Observers, from the elderly baker to the wandering minstrel, moved with the measured pace of a centuries-old rhythm. When the sky darkened at high noon, a sudden rain fell, turning the stones into a glossy mirror that reflected the bustling crowd. The wet wool of the sheep grew heavier, exhaling a musky perfume that clung to the damp air like a sigh. Pigs, startled by the sudden drizzle, squealed louder, their voices echoing off the narrow arches and adding a sharp counterpoint to the market's hum. Townsfolk furrowed brows as the mingling scents grew more potent, the odor seeping into woven shawls and leather satchels, making the usual exchanges feel oppressive. The rain's rhythm seemed to press the atmosphere tighter, a subtle pressure that tested the patience of each passerby. Yet amid the growing discomfort, a baker, wiping flour from his hands, offered a half smile and a warm loaf to a shivering child, the bread's yeasty aroma briefly outshining the livestock scent. A farmer, his boots splashing in puddles, paused to watch a duck waddling through the mire, finding humor in the animal's obliviousness to the market's chaos. The crowd's irritated murmurs softened into quiet chuckles as they realized the shared absurdity of their situation. Even the pigs, now damp, settled into the mud with a resigned grunt, as if acknowledging the inevitable compromise of coexistence. In that small exchange, the collective tension cracked open, revealing a gentle irony that life could be both smelly and sweet at once. As the rain tapered off, the streets dried under a pale sun, leaving a glistening sheen that reflected the faces of weary shoppers. People adjusted their steps, the scent of wet wool now mingling with the faint scent of fresh bread and sun-warmed stone. A group of women, seated beneath a canvas awning, began to weave together strands of straw, their laughter quiet and steady, a counterpoint to the lingering odor. Children, their cheeks flushed, skipped past the market stalls, their focus on a simple game of catch rather than the lingering perfume of the animals. The market settled into a slower tempo, each participant finding a personal rhythm within the shared space. When the day finally bowed to evening, the townsfolk drifted home, the streets emptying like a slowly closing book. The lingering smell of wet fur and earth lingered in memory, a reminder of the day's tangled tapestry of commerce, rain, and animal life. In the quiet of their hearths, elders recounted the market's odor not as a complaint, but as a testament to communal endurance. The experience lingered as a soft lesson that even the most pungent moments can become part of a town's quiet chronicle, etched into stone and story alike. With a gentle sigh, the town fell asleep, the scent of the day drifting out through open windows like a whispered recollection. At first light, the market square awoke to the clatter of wooden carts and the low murmur of townsfolk gathering. Cows and goats tethered to stone posts released a faint, earthy breath that mingled with the scent of fresh bread. The central fountain, a marble basin framed by ivy, reflected the amber sunrise, while children chased pigeons along its rim. Stallholders arranged copper pans and woolen bolts in orderly rows, their hands moving with practiced rhythm. The mayor, a stout man in a faded blue coat, inspected the arrangement with a measured nod, his eyes lingering on the line of livestock. All seemed poised for a day of ordinary exchange, the air holding a quiet promise of routine. When a startled ox slipped its leash, the animal bolted across the cobbles, hooves echoing like distant drums. Its massive frame collided with the fountain's stone edge, sending a spray of water and brown slurry into the air. The cascade fell upon the nearby stalls, staining linen and scattering grain into a glossy river of waste. Vendors shouted, their voices tangled with the sudden splash, while a few shoppers clutched their coats against the dampness. The street, already warm, now exhaled a sharp, pungent odor that rose like a low fog over the square. The mayor raised his hands, his voice trying to rise above the coughing and muttering of the crowd, but each word was swallowed by the stench. Women covered their noses with handkerchiefs, and children giggled nervously as they stepped around the dripping plaster. The market's rhythm faltered. A baker paused, flour coated in a thin layer of the spill, while a fishmonger retreated to the shadow of his awning. Yet, amid the chaos, a few old men continued to barter, their trades whispered with a resigned humor that softened the tension. The foul scent seemed to peak, hovering above the square like a dull veil, threatening the town's modest reputation beyond its walls. Still, the crowd never fully dispersed, their footsteps slow and measured, as if the day had already begun to fold into memory. As the sun climbed, a group of volunteers fetched wooden buckets and began to mop the fountain's rim, their movements steady and unhurried. The water, now tinged with brown, was gently poured back into the basin, the flow calming the swirling surface. Market stalls reopened, cloths smoothed, and the scent of roasted chestnuts reasserted itself over the lingering odor. The mayor, his coat damp, offered quiet thanks to those who stayed, his voice low and steady like a ticking clock. The square settled into a muted hum, the earlier uproar fading into the background of ordinary commerce. When evening draped the town in a soft amber glow, the square stood quiet, the fountain's surface reflecting the lanterns now lit along the arches. Residents lingered, sipping tea and sharing the day's odd tale, their laughter restrained but sincere. The episode lingered in the collective memory, not as a disaster, but as a reminder of the fragile balance between livelihood and nature's unbidden turn. Children, now asleep on their mothers' laps, breathed easily, unaware of the earlier turmoil that had briefly stained their world. In the hush, the mayor's silhouette merged with the shadows, his profile blurred as if the past were a faint watercolor. The town, for all its imperfections, kept moving forward, each step measured, each breath a quiet affirmation of endurance. At first light, the market's lanes swelled with the steady shuffle of cattle, goats, and laden carts, their breath mingling with the damp chill of early morning. The town's stone walls echoed the soft clang of metal tools as merchants arranged bolts of cloth beside the animal pens. Children darted between stalls, their feet kicking up thin clouds of dust that settled on the worn wooden benches. Lanterns flickered weakly, casting amber halos over the faces of weary laborers. A distant bell tolled, marking the hour when the town's rhythm turned from quiet to bustling, and the air grew thick with the promise of commerce. As the sun climbed, the scent of sweat, manure, and stale grain coalesced into an unmistakable haze that clung to the market's arches. Vendors coughed softly, wiping their brows with coarse cloth that only smeared the odor further into the cracks of the pavement. The heat pressed against the backs of townsfolk, making the stone feel warm under their palm, and the air feel heavier with each breath. A carriage driver swore under his breath as his horse sneezed, scattering a spray of damp fur into the already saturated atmosphere. Even the river that wound past the square seemed to hold its breath, its surface rippling with a faint, reluctant calm, and the bell of the town tower rang at dusk. A small group of volunteers gathered, their faces blurred by the twilight, to sweep the streets and wash the stones with cold water from the well. They dragged bundles of fragrant herbs, lavender, sage, rosemary, over the cobbles, crushing them between calloused fingers, releasing a faint perfume that fought the lingering musk. As they lit the herbs in simple iron braziers, the flickering light painted their sleepy eyes with amber shadows, and the first gentle gust carried the scent outward. Ironically, the very act of cleaning seemed to invite more attention to the previous filth. Each inhalation a reminder of what had been endured. Yet the volunteers continued, their motions slow and deliberate, as if time itself had been coaxed into a slower cadence. The evening wind shifted, lifting the herbaceous aroma and mixing it with the cooling air that brushed against the stone facades. The stale heaviness lifted like a veil, revealing the faint glow of lanterns that now seemed welcoming rather than oppressive. Families gathered on low benches, spreading modest loaves and boiled stew upon rough wooden tables, their hands warm against the cool night. Laughter rose softly, a low hum that matched the rustle of leaves as the breeze whispered through the alleys. The market's chaos settled into a quiet tableau, where the scent of fresh bread momentarily overrode the memory of the day's odors. Under the dimming sky, the townspeople lingered, their conversation drifting from the day's labor to stories of past market days. Each tale a gentle reminder of impermanence. The faint scent of herbs lingered, now a comforting backdrop to the crackle of the braziers and the soft clink of ceramic cups. A sense of gratitude settled over the square, not in grand declarations, but in the simple relief of a breath drawn without effort. In the quiet after the feast, the bell tower's slow chime marked the close of another chapter, its echo carrying the lesson that even the most oppressive smells eventually yield to fresh breezes. The night settled, calm and unhurried, as the town slipped into a restful pause, ready to awaken anew with the next sunrise. The stone streets of Linduic glowed amber in the late afternoon. The market, stalls sighing under canvas awnings as traders rattled coins and offered dried figs. Brother Alaric, his habit still damp from the spring rain of his pilgrimage, stepped off the carriage with a satchel of vellum scrolls tucked under his arm. The scent of peat smoke mingled with the earthy perfume of fresh herbs that Matilda, the town healer, had arranged on her wooden table. Children paused their chase to watch the monk's gentle tread, while the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer provided a steady rhythm to the town's bustle. In his eyes, a quiet curiosity flickered, a glint that hinted at ideas about water and cleanliness gathered from distant cloisters, yet the guild of barbers' surgeons gathered around their copper basin, their robes stained with the coppery scent of bloodletting, and their murmurs turned toward the newcomer. Their master, a broad-shouldered man named Gervase, lifted a rusted lancet and asked Alaric, in a tone that barely concealed disdain, whether the monks' purified streams could cure the fevers that still clung to the town's children. Matilda, polishing a jar of dried lavender, answered with a measured smile, pointing out that the old communal bath had served their ancestors for generations, its steam already scented with ash and sweat. Alaric unfolded a parchment, tracing faint diagrams of filtered wells and the gentle flow of running water, while the guild's apprentices shifted uneasily, their tools clinking against stone. The air grew thicker with the sound of distant goats and the low hum of a crowd that sensed a subtle shift, the tension palpable as each side guarded its familiar ritual. As the evening market lights flickered, an elderly woman arrived drenched in river water, insisting that the cold will drive out the humors, even as the barber's apprentice tried to shave a child's head with a blade that had seen more scalp than scalpels. The crowd chuckled softly when the apprentice, distracted by the monk's diagrams, accidentally sprayed a splash of rain onto a bundle of herbs, which burst into a fragrant puff that seemed to mock the seriousness of the debate. Gervase, wiping his hands on a stained apron, remarked that the town's greatest invention was still the communal bath, where neighbors exchanged gossip louder than the gurgle of the water. Meanwhile, Alaric, who had expected reverent nods, found his proposal reduced to a whispered joke about bathing like the fish of the holy river that drifted through the stalls. The irony settled like a thin layer of dust over the scene, the very act of cleansing becoming a quiet performance for an audience accustomed to the spectacle of blood. When the market's clangor softened under the evening sky, a few townsfolk lingered beside the town well, their hands tracing the cool stone as they listened to Alaric's soft explanations of sediment filters. Matilda set a kettle of warm broth on a low fire, the steam curling up like gentle sighs that mingled with the faint mist rising from the well's surface. The barber surgeons, now seated on rough benches, watched the water ripple, their needles resting quietly, as the monk's voice slipped into a calm cadence, describing how filtered streams could lengthen a carpenter's years. Shadows stretched across the cobbles, and the distant church bell tolled, not as a proclamation, but as a metronome to the slow breathing of the gathered crowd. In that stillness, the conflict seemed to dissolve into a shared curiosity, the town's pulse sinking with the gentle lap of water against stone. Days later, the well's water carried a faint hint of charcoal, a modest improvement that the children accepted without fanfare, their feet splashing lightly as they fetched water for their chores. Brother Alaric continued his humble work, noting that change arrived not in sudden torrents, but in the patient drip of habit altered by a single observation. Matilda, still tending her herb bundles, smiled at the subtle shift, recognizing that the ancient rituals could coexist with a quieter, cleaner flow. The barber's surgeons kept their lancets, yet some began to rinse their tools in the filtered water, the clink now softened by a softer sound. The town's story unfolded like the steady breathing of an old stone wall, reminding any listener that human imperfection is both the source of stubborn tradition and the seed of gentle progress, a quiet echo that steadies the mind as night falls. In the early light of the river valley, Alaric, a mason with hands scarred by stone, guided a group of villagers to dig a modest well at the edge of the market square. The bucket he lowered into the fresh spring made a soft splash that seemed louder than any bell, and the water gathered a faint, cool mist that brushed the sun-warmed stone. He spoke in plain tones about the comfort of clean skin, the ease of rinsing hands after the day's labor, and the small pleasure of a clear draught after a long walk. Children gathered, eyes wide, as they cupped the water, and felt its refreshing chill against their palms. The well stood as a new, quiet promise, a simple stone circle, promising a change no one could yet name. Soon the air grew thick with whispers, and Matilda, the weaver whose loom hummed beside the well, raised her voice among the guildmen, accusing Alaric of disturbing the balance that generations of charm and incense had guarded. They spoke of hidden shadows, of demons awakened by the sudden clarity of water, their words echoing off the timbered walls like distant drums. As the village slept, a fever swept through the low-born and the noble alike, its heat rising like a slow wind over the fields, and the scent of herbs burned in the hearths grew sharper. The villagers glanced between the well's pristine surface and the dark wood of the guild hall, each breath a question of which safety was real. Fear settled like a thin fog, urging them to clutch old amulets as tightly as they held their trembling mugs. In the days that followed, the well's water, untouched by superstition, continued to flow steady and cool, while the fever clung stubbornly to the fevered throats of those who had sought solace in prayerful charms. The irony lay in the quiet observation that the clear water did not cleanse the invisible illness. Yet the heated stones of the guild's incense did little to lower the villagers' fevers. Mothers, whose hands were still stained with dye, rinsed their faces at the well, feeling the simple relief of cool droplets on flushed skin, even as their children shivered beneath wool blankets. The guildmen watched, their faces blurred behind the soot of their hearths, as people slipped between old rituals and new habits with a measured pace. Laughter, rare and faint, slipped from a corner where an old baker shared a loaf, his crumbs scattering like small, indifferent stars. As the fever waned with the turning of the sun, the market square settled into a rhythm that blended the old with the new. The well became a place where a farmer would pause, dip his bucket, and then return to the field, while beside it an elder still tied a knot of sage to his doorway for protection. The guild, though bruised by rumor, continued to mend fabrics, their needles clicking in time with the steady drip of water. And the weaver's loom swayed, as if hearing a silent hymn to compromise. Children played at the edge, their feet splashing in the shallow rim, their laughter a soft percussion that seemed to smooth the remaining edges of tension. Evening shadows lengthened, and the stone of the well absorbed the amber glow, its surface reflecting a calm that was neither triumph nor defeat, but simply continuation. The villagers moved through their chores with a measured breath, their lives a tapestry woven with both clean threads and weathered fibers. When the last torch sputtered out and the night wrapped the valley in a gentle hush, the story of the well and the guild lingered like a faint scent of pine in the cool air. Observers might note how human habit clings to comfort, yet also how a simple act of washing can carve a quiet path through inherited fear. The blurred faces of those who once shouted now rest in the memory of a village that learned without fanfare, that change arrives in slow droplets rather than thunderous proclamations. In the stillness, the water kept its steady rhythm, reminding all that imperfection resides not in the act of cleansing, but in the hesitation to accept it. History, patient as ever, records the episode as a soft ripple in the river of ordinary lives, a reminder that even the smallest streams shape the banks over time. In the low stone hall of Ravensbrook, the town council gathered as dawn light filtered through mullioned windows, casting a soft amber on the heavy wooden table. Alaric, a young physician, spread inked parchments that traced the rise of fever to the stagnant pool behind the market stalls. Matilda, his sister, whispered of clotted water, her voice barely rising above the rustle of parchment. The reformers spoke with careful calm, pointing to the discoloration of the water and the smell of decay that hung in the early air. Outside, the cobblestones retained the chill of night, a reminder that the village breathed as slowly as its people. A murmur rose from the elder traditionalists, their faces lit by candle flame that threw shadows over their furrowed brows. They invoked the ancient oath of the river guard, a promise etched on stone centuries ago, and the unseen protection of patron saints whose faces remained blurred by the flickering light. Their arguments were punctuated by the soft thud of wooden gavel, each tap echoing like a distant drumbeat through the vaulted ceiling. The counselor's hands brushed the cool surface of the table, feeling the grain worn smooth by generations of debate. Tension settled like a low fog, heavy yet unmoving, as each side weighed the weight of tradition against the quiet urgency of illness. When the moon slipped high, a handful of masked figures slipped through the narrow alley behind the well, their steps muffled by the damp earth. With a sudden crash, the newly erected well, gleaming with fresh stone, was toppled, its water spilling into the darkness like an accusation. The townsfolk awoke to the sound of breaking stone and the acrid scent of disturbed soil. Their faces illuminated briefly by the startled torches of night watchmen, the irony of the reformers' own project being undone by unseen hands was not lost on the few who had lingered in the shadows. Soon, a low murmur blossomed into a restless murmur that rippled through the streets, a riot of restless feet seeking answers that the night refused to give. Seeking refuge, Alaric and Matilda slipped through the narrow gate of the monastery, whose cloister garden lay hushed beneath a veil of twilight. The stone arches welcomed them with cool, steady breaths, and the scent of lavender from a solitary pot eased the tremor in their shoulders. Candles flickered along the corridor, casting gentle orange halos that danced on the worn flagstones as they walked in quiet cadence. Within the modest cells, the sisters found a steady rhythm in the low creak of wooden doors and the distant echo of monks' chants, a background hum that soothed the clamor outside. The night settled around them like a soft blanket, allowing the pulse of their weary hearts to slow to a measured, patient beat. At first light, Alaric stood before the cracked well, his hands tracing the rough edges of stone, feeling the chill of morning seep into his fingertips. He thought of the council's heated words, the blurred silhouettes of saints, and the strange, stubborn resilience of a village bound by memory and mud. Matilda poured water from a simple earthen jar into a shallow basin, watching the ripples expand slowly, each concentric circle a quiet reminder of cause and consequence. Their thoughts settled on the subtle truth that progress often arrives on the backs of ordinary moments, unnoticed yet persistent. As the sun warmed the terracotta roofs, a calm acceptance settled over them, a gentle acknowledgement that human imperfection, like the slow turning of a wheel, carries its own quiet grace. When the winter wind carried a thin, bitter haze over the riverbank village, the first coughs rose like distant drumbeats, and the cobblestones grew slick with the chill of illness. Mothers wrapped their children in homespun shawls, while the town bells tolled a low, steady rhythm that seemed to count each new fever. A small group of reformers, their satchels heavy with rosemary, lavender, and vinegar, set up a modest stand beside the well, offering herbal brews and scrubbed cloths to anyone who would listen. Their hands moved deliberately, wiping door frames and stirring pots, while the scent of steam rose faintly in the cold air. The villagers watched with a mixture of curiosity and weariness, aware that the plague was no ordinary visitor, yet uncertain how much comfort a scented rag could provide. Across the square, the guild of bloodalters and the clergy's aides gathered beneath a weathered canopy, their tables cluttered with sharp knives, brass basins, and holy relics, whose faces were forever hidden by the flickering torchlight. They spoke in hushed tones about ancient balance, insisting that the removal of bad humors would restore order, and they raised their voices just enough for the market crowd to hear the clink of metal against bone. Children craned their necks to watch the crimson streams, while the reformers passed by, their aprons damp with clean water, a stark contrast to the metallic scent that lingered in the air. The tension grew as more villagers stepped into the line of the bloodalters, trusting the familiar ritual over the unfamiliar scent of herbs. In the background, the distant clatter of carts and the occasional bark of a dog punctuated the uneasy silence that settled like a thin fog over the square. By midday, the sun had softened, casting a warm amber glow over the stone arches, when Alaric, a young apprentice with steady hands, stepped forward, carrying a shallow bowl of crystal-clear water infused with crushed chamomile. He lifted a trembling child, whose fevered cheeks glowed faintly, and gently poured the cool liquid over the boy's forehead, the droplets creating a faint mist that caught the light. The crowd held its breath as the child's breathing steadied, his eyes opening more fully, and a quiet murmur of surprise rippled through the assembled townsfolk. Alaric's demonstration, performed without a single blade or prayer, seemed to speak louder than any chant, and even the guild master lowered his scalpel, his expression slackening into a puzzled calm. The moment lingered, the soft trickle of water echoing the sigh of relief that settled over the square like a soft blanket. In the hours that followed, the townspeople gathered around the modest infirmary the reformers had erected, its walls painted a pale, soothing hue, and offered their own cloths to be washed and hung out to dry in the gentle breeze. The scent of rosemary mingled with the earthy smell of damp stone, creating an atmosphere that felt both clean and familiar, as if the village itself were taking a deep, steady breath. Patients were tended with careful rinses and warm poultices, and the once bustling market stalls now slowed, their merchants watching the slow, steady rhythm of recovery rather than the frantic rush of panic. The Guild of Bloodalters, seeing the shift in the crowd's trust, began to share their own tools, cleaning them with the same herbal solutions, their knives now glinting less menacingly. Over the days, mortality numbers eased, and the town's pace returned to its measured cadence, the harsh clang of panic replaced by the soft rustle of pages turning in a dimly lit bakery. When the last echo of the plague's cough faded into the quiet of an evening sky, the villagers found themselves lingering by the well, their hands still damp from the daily ritual of washing. They spoke in low tones about the strange balance between old certainty and new caution, their words carrying the weight of experience, yet tinged with a gentle amusement at how a simple bowl of water could move a whole community. Children played near the stone steps, their laughter a soft percussion that blended with the distant lowing of cattle, while the reformers and traditionalists exchanged quiet nods, their differences softened by shared loss and quiet endurance. The night settled in, its cool embrace wrapping the rooftops, and the town settled into a rhythm that honored both the past and the tentative steps forward, as if the very walls exhaled a sigh of weary contentment. In that lingering stillness, history seemed to pause, observing the human tendency to cling, to adapt, and ultimately to find solace in the smallest acts of clean, deliberate care. When the fever finally loosened its grip on the stone-faced market town, the council gathered beneath the cracked arches to draft a charter of public wells and scheduled washing. The parchment, inked in faded black, listed the new obligations. Each household must fetch water from the communal cistern at sunrise and rinse hands before the evening bell rang. Traders paused their haggling, feeling the cold stone beneath their boots as the words settled like dust in the courtyard. Mothers, whose children had watched their faces pale, whispered hopeful sighs, while the wind carried the scent of damp earth. In the quiet that followed, the town seemed to inhale a tentative promise of cleaner days. Not all ears welcomed the decree. The old guild of well keepers, whose families had tended the hidden springs for generations, muttered under their breath as they watched the council's quill strike the paper. Their hands, calloused from lifting buckets, remembered the taste of mineral water that had never been filtered, and they feared a loss of the familiar rhythm that marked each season. At the tavern, heated voices rose over mugs of sour ale, the clatter of wooden chairs punctuating arguments about autonomy and pride. Matilda, once a proud apothecary, whose herbal concoctions had soothed fevers, felt the weight of her own hesitation as the reformers appointed her guardian of cleanliness. The candlelight flickered on her solemn face, casting a shadow that hid any certainty and the room settled into a tense stillness. Ironically, the very herbs Matilda had once distilled for coughs, lavender, rosemary, and yarrow, proved most useful in the new washing rituals, their fragrant steam curling above the communal basin. She mixed the dried leaves into the water, watching the pale liquid turn a soft amber as townsfolk dipped their hands and listened to the gentle splash that echoed like a lullaby. The reformers, who had advocated for plain, boiled water, found themselves grateful for the familiar scent that reminded them of home hearths. Children, previously reluctant to scrub their forearms, now giggled while the suds tickled their skin, unaware that tradition and innovation had tangled like a humble rope. The council's stern proclamations softened as the practical benefits of the old herbs rendered the conflict almost comical in hindsight. As weeks turned to months, the town's rhythm settled into a blended cadence. The public wells drummed a steady flow, and the sunrise washing became as regular as the church bell, though its sound went unnoticed beneath the murmuring of daily chores. Women hung linen towels on low beams, feeling the warm cloth against their fingertips, while men polished iron buckets, their breath fogging in the crisp morning air. Matilda moved between stalls, offering a pinch of rosemary to those who asked, her voice low and matter of fact, like a gentle tide. The old guildsmen, now tasked with maintaining the new basins, found pride in the smooth stone that reflected their weathered faces, a bridge between heritage and health. Even the town's children, who had once chased each other through puddles for sport, now paused at the well, their eyes bright with quiet curiosity rather than rebellion. When the last of the charter's ink dried, the townspeople looked back on the uneasy months as a soft lesson in how change need not erase memory, but can fold it into a broader comfort. The scent of herb-infused water lingered in the lanes, a reminder that humanity's attempts at order are always tinged with the imperfections of its own hands. Matilda, now older and slower, would sit on the stone steps and watch the water ripple, feeling the cool mist kiss her cheek as if the town itself were breathing gently. The council's parchment, once a symbol of authority, became a faded backdrop to the ordinary sounds of washing, laughter, and the clink of wooden mugs, showing that history lives in the small, steady motions. In that hush, the battle seemed not a clash, but a quiet negotiation, sealing a hybrid tradition that honored both the past's roots and the future's need for cleanliness. In the late afternoon light of Eldoria, the marble arches of the viral house caught the amber glow, their surfaces brushed with a thin layer of fragrant oil that whispered sandalwood and citrus. Servants moved silently, polishing brass handles until their fingertips tingled with the cool metal, while distant lanes of the city exhaled the sour tang of refuse and damp wood. Lady Seraphine stood at the threshold, her silk gown rustling softly as she inhaled the curated perfume that floated like a veil over the courtyard. The scent was a measured greeting, intended to announce status before a single word was spoken. Beyond the stone gate, the neighboring quarter drifted a heavier, unfiltered air that clung to stone walls and market stalls. As evening approached, the household began the meticulous task of layering aromas, a ritual that involved heating ambergris in copper cauldrons and spreading rose petals across polished floors. The kitchen staff stirred the simmering mixture, their sleeves damp with sweat, while the master perfumer guided them with precise gestures, his hands tracing invisible lines of hierarchy. Outside, a sudden wind carried a brief whiff of the river's stagnant water up the narrow alleys, reminding the servants of the city's underlying stench. The vials tightened shutters, and Lady Seraphine ordered extra trays of crushed jasmine to be positioned near the grand doors, a silent defense against the encroaching odor. Each breath taken inside grew more intentional, as if the air itself could be shaped into a symbol of wealth. The banquet commenced under a canopy of lanterns that flickered like muted fireflies, their light casting warm shadows on long oak tables laden with silverware and platters of glazed figs. Guests murmured appreciatively as they passed bowls of honeyed apricots, their noses briefly lifted to savor the scented clouds that rose from each dish. Yet, between courses, a faint sourness slipped through the cracks of the marble, a reminder that the sewers below still exhaled their own lament. A servant, unnoticed, brushed a stray onion peel into the fragrant oil, and the resulting clash produced a momentary sour note that made a few polite smiles tighten. The irony lay in the careful orchestration of perfume, now slightly marred by a slip that no one would admit to, as laughter continued in a measured, sleepy cadence. The room settled back into its scented equilibrium, the brief discord fading like a muted chord. After the final toast, the candles guttered low, casting a soft amber haze that lingered over the empty plates and the polished silver. Lady Seraphine walked the aisle, her steps muffled by plush carpets, feeling the lingering warmth of the scented oils settle into the stone as a gentle afterglow. The household staff began the quiet task of sweeping ash and wiping down tables, their motions slow and methodical, each cloth absorbing a trace of the evening's perfume. The muted clink of a distant glass echoed faintly, blending with the distant hum of the market quarter, where the air remained unrefined. In this softened silence, the house seemed to breathe a contented sigh, the layered aromas now part of the stone's memory. In the early hours before dawn, Lady Seraphine stood alone on the balcony, the cool night air brushing against her cheek, contrasting with the lingering sweetness that still clung to the walls. She regarded the cityscape, where lanterns flickered in the poorer districts, their light fighting the darkness without the aid of fragrance. A thought settled within her, quiet as the settling dust, that the scented veil could never fully conceal the underlying currents of life that rose from the streets below. The marble arches, now dim, seemed to hold the faint echo of both perfume and waste, a reminder of the fragile balance between display and reality. She turned inward, feeling the gentle fatigue of a night spent orchestrating illusion, and allowed herself a small, weary smile. The moment passed with the same steady calm that had guided her family for generations, an unhurried acceptance of the limits of scent and status. The great hall of Lord Maravik filled with polished oak tables, their surfaces glinting under amber lanterns. Guests in silk and brocade whispered over crystal goblets, while a faint perfume of rose oil lingered in the vaulted air. The estate's reputation for refined hospitality rested on this scented veil, a subtle yet unmistakable sign of wealth. Yet, beyond the marble arches, the kitchen hearth throbbed with the steady clatter of iron pans and the murmur of overtaxed cooks. A discreet network of stone vents threaded through the walls, carrying the bustling sounds, and unseen, the bitter fumes of boiled offal away from the banquet. In that quiet juxtaposition, the scene unfolded like a painting hung in a museum, each brushstroke holding both elegance and hidden labor. Tomas, a young attendant with ink-stained sleeves, slipped between pillars to fetch fresh figs, his ears catching a low whistle from the vent shaft. Warm air brushed his cheek, tinged not with rose, but with the sour sting of spoiled fish and charcoal smoke. He followed the draught down a narrow stair, where damp stone walls bore the damp imprint of discarded bones. The kitchen doors stood ajar, and from within rose a chorus of clanking knives and the occasional slap of a wet rag against the floor. Tomas felt the room's perfume falter for a heartbeat as the hidden current of odor brushed his senses, and a quiet unease settled in his chest. The realization that the noble scent was a mask, held together by concealed vents, lingered like a thin veil of fog. Later, as the candlelight flickered, Tomas overheard a conspiratorial whisper between two senior cooks near the hearth. They spoke of a ledger that listed each vent's maintenance, noting how the noble family paid extra to line the ducts with fragrant herbs, buying silence for their reputation. The irony was stark. The very luxury they coveted relied on the labor of those whose hands stained the very air they pretended to cleanse. A plan formed to reveal the truth at the next gathering, to let the banquet's guests taste the unadorned breath of the kitchens. Yet, as Tomas lingered in the shadowed doorway, the soft laughter of the guests drifted down, a reminder that the world often prefers comforting illusion to harsh reality. The tension folded into a gentle hum, as if the hall itself held its breath, waiting for a moment that might never arrive. As the evening deepened, the lantern's glow softened, casting amber pools on the polished floor where silver forks clinked against porcelain. The servants moved in quiet rhythm, their footsteps muffled by thick rugs, and the vents continued their unseen work, carrying faint traces of stew and ash into the night. The banquet proceeded without interruption. Voices hushed over courses of braised lamb and honeyed figs, each bite accompanied by the distant sigh of a kitchen door closing. Tomas returned to his station, his palms warm from the figs, his thoughts settled like the lingering steam above a pot. The hall exhaled a steady, scented breath. The artificial perfume now blended subtly with the faint, honest aroma rising from below. In that steady cadence, the night wrapped the manor in a blanket of tranquil acceptance, masking the undercurrent of effort with a soft, perpetual hush. When the last candle guttered and the guests departed, the grand hall fell into a hushed silence, broken only by the occasional creak of timber. The vents, now still, released a final sigh of kitchen breath, a reminder that even the most polished facades are built upon unseen toil. Tomas lingered by the marble fireplace, feeling the cool stone against his back and the faint, lingering scent of rosemary mingling with the earthy note of boiled vegetables. He understood that the aristocracy's pride lay not merely in the scent they displayed, but in the willingness to conceal the messiness of humanity behind fragrant curtains. The night air outside carried the faint perfume of distant fields, as if nature offered a quieter honesty than any cultivated perfume could. In the quiet aftermath, history seemed to yawn, noting with gentle amusement that humans will always fashion invisible masks to smooth the rough edges of their own making. In the dim afternoon light of Lady Seraphine's drawing room, the muted rustle of silk curtains mingled with the faint clink of porcelain, as the noblewoman awaited the arrival of the recluse alchemist Marwin. A single candle flickered, casting soft amber shadows on the polished oak floor, while servants moved through the hall in quiet, measured steps. Lady Seraphine had sent a discreet summons, aware that the scent of her garden lilies could not conceal the undercurrent of stale kitchen odors that whispered through the manor's stone walls. Marwin entered without fanfare, his coat dusted with ash, his eyes reflecting a practiced calm that matched the room's hush. He bowed lightly, and the air seemed to hold its breath, as if the very walls sensed the gravity of the meeting. Marwan spoke in a low, measured tone, describing a resinous incense he had distilled from rare herbs, a blend capable of neutralizing any lingering odor that threatened the polished veneer of aristocratic life. He explained that the incense worked by binding volatile compounds, turning them into a faint, warm mist that dissolved into the room's ambient temperature without leaving trace. Yet his fingers, stained with earth, trembled slightly as he mentioned the limited stock. A handful of sealed vials gathered from a distant mountain spring, now dwindling with each use. The alchemist warned that once the last vial was burned, the subtle perfume of privilege would yield to the honest smell of hearth and sweat. Lady Seraphine listened, the furrow on her brow softening as the reality of a finite solution settled over the polished veneer of her estate. A quiet irony lingered in the room, as the elite, ever vigilant of the faintest whiff of imperfection, now faced the prospect that their scented shield might soon disappear. The servants, accustomed to polishing silverware and arranging bouquets, exchanged glances that spoke of shared fatigue, their breath carrying the faint aroma of boiled vegetables and wood smoke beneath the genteel facade. Marwan's creation, though powerful, seemed almost theatrical, a fleeting veil over a reality that could not be permanently concealed. The very act of masking the scent revealed how deeply the notion of purity had been woven into the fabric of daily rituals. From the way linens were folded to the timing of meals, even as the incense promised invisibility, the room's stillness hinted at an underlying acceptance of human messiness, dressed in soft irony. That evening, as dusk settled into a muted ochre hue, Marwan carefully unsealed a vial, and the incense released a slow, amber plume that curled lazily above the polished mahogany mantel. The scent was warm, reminiscent of dried figs and sun-baked earth, and it seemed to settle like a gentle blanket over the room, absorbing the faint tang of coal smoke from the kitchen below. The candlelight flickered against the walls, casting a rhythmic pattern that matched the soft inhale and exhale of those present. Each breath now shared with the quiet hum of the incense burning. Lady Seraphine traced her fingertip along the edge of the mantel, feeling the slight heat radiating from the ember, and nodded in quiet approval. In the background, a servant quietly swept a hallway, the broom's brush whispering against stone, as the masked air allowed a brief respite from the constant vigilance of scent. Weeks later, when the final ember sputtered out and the last trace of incense faded, The manor's corridors carried a different aroma, a subtle mixture of wood, herbs, and the honest scent of lived days. Lady Seraphine stood at the window, watching the garden's dusk settle, and felt a calm acceptance that the illusion of untouchable purity was as fleeting as the incense itself. The house, now breathing its own natural perfume, seemed to settle into a quieter rhythm, the servants' movements less hurried, the meals prepared with a modest pride rather than concealment. In that softened atmosphere, the noblewoman reflected on the alchemist's warning, recognizing that the very act of masking had highlighted the value of authenticity. However imperfect, the quiet evening closed on a gentle sigh, a reminder that human frailty, when observed with calm eyes, carries its own quiet dignity. The great hall of the manor filled with low amber light as servants arranged golden platters and polished silver candelabras. Above the long oak tables, thin coils of sandalwood incense swayed, releasing a sweet, papery fragrance meant to veil the damp stone that lay hidden beneath the floorboards. Nobles in silk doublets and embroidered gowns took their seats, their polished shoes clicking softly on the polished tiles, while the murmur of polite conversation rose like a warm tide. In the corner, a senior steward whispered to the kitchen mistress about the final batch of masking incense, noting that the supply would run out before the next tide of guests. The air hummed with expectation, each breath a measured mixture of perfume and anticipation, as if the very room were holding its breath for the evening to begin. As the first course arrived, a sudden draught slipped through the narrow window, left ajar for the evening breeze, stirring the hanging incense ribbons. The gentle wind carried with it an unexpected note of rot, a faint scent of mildew and stale waste that rose from the unseen cellar below. A collective gasp fluttered across the nobles' faces, their brows furrowing as the perfume dissolved into the harsher odor, like a veil torn in a quiet storm. Some ladies lifted their lace fans, not to cool themselves, but to shield the nose from the pungent intrusion, while a footman paused, his hand trembling on the polished surface of the silver tureen. The clinking of cutlery softened, replaced by a low murmur of confusion, each participant feeling the room's temperature shift subtly as the hidden smell settled like fog. From the shadowed doorway, a group of workers, cloaked in coarse wool, their hands still stained from the coal-fired ovens, stepped forward, their voices low but steady. One of them, his cheek dusted with ash, spoke of the cellar's overflow, describing how the waste of the servants' kitchens had seeped into the stone, refusing any fragrant veil. The noble lord, his fingers tightening around the rim of his goblet, listened with a forced composure that quivered like a candle flame in a draught. A murmur rose among the common folk, a quiet chorus demanding that the truth not be hidden behind scented smoke. Their words echoing against the high arches with a sober rhythm. The irony lay thick as the aristocracy, accustomed to masking their own failings with silk and perfume, now faced a raw honesty that smelled of earth and neglect. The hall fell into a tentative lull, the clatter of dishes resuming as if to stitch the frayed atmosphere back together. A senior lady, her face composed yet her eyes soft, raised a cup and offered a toast to shared burdens and honest breath, her voice steady and warm as amber. Around the table, nobles and workers alike inclined their heads, the scent of incense now mingling with the lingering decay, creating a muted harmony that settled into the wood. Servants moved with deliberate care, wiping crumbs and adjusting the remaining incense coils, their motions slow as if measuring time itself. In the dim corners, the candlelight flickered quietly, casting gentle shadows that softened the edges of the confrontation, allowing the room to settle into a subdued equilibrium. As the evening waned, the last ember dimmed, leaving the great hall bathed in a soft, soot-stained glow that seemed to sigh with relief. History, like the aging plaster of the walls, remembered the night not for the splendor of the feast, but for the quiet revelation that fragrance cannot forever conceal decay. The nobles departed with measured steps, their cloaks brushing the floor, while the workers lingered a moment longer, inhaling the honest air as a quiet promise of change. Outside, the night wind brushed the shutters, carrying with it the faint scent of distant fields, a reminder that some odors are born of the earth and cannot be soothed by incense. In the stillness that followed, the hall stood as a patient witness to human imperfection, its stones holding the memory of a breath once hidden, now released into the calm of night. In the early mornings of the capital, the stone facades of the aristocratic quarter caught the pale light like softened marble. Behind heavy drapes scented with lavender oil, the noble families kept their homes perfumed, a quiet badge of status that drifted through polished corridors. Servants moved silently, carrying sealed jars of amber incense, while the faint, sweet perfume masked the deeper, sour odors that rose from crowded kitchens and damp cellars. The city's alleys, by contrast, exhaled the honest smell of river mud and market fish, a reminder that scent divided the streets as surely as wealth did. In these moments, the air itself seemed to hold its breath, holding the secret of a hierarchy written in fragrance. One humid summer, a sudden gust forced a cracked window open in Lady Seraphine's manor, spilling a whiff of fermenting cheese and stale smoke into the courtyard. Neighbors, unused to such raw aroma, gathered at the threshold, murmuring about the decay hidden beneath the gilded veneer. The city council, already uneasy about the disparity between public cleanliness and private opulence, summoned the lady to a closed chamber where the council's clerks laid out complaints on coarse parchment. The debate grew louder as the marble walls reflected the rustle of petitions, each line a thin strand of resentment woven from the scent of everyday labor. By nightfall, the council's quill had marked a decree insisting on open ventilation and the transparent trade of fragrant goods, a law that trembled on the edge of both reform and ridicule. When the edict arrived at the manor, it was delivered in a gilded box wrapped in rose petals, an almost theatrical gesture that made the irony taste sweet. Lady Seraphine, whose mornings had begun with the soft rustle of scented silk, found herself instructed to replace her secretive aromatic walls with plain mullioned windows that invited the street's breeze. The noble housekeepers, accustomed to hiding the stench of waste beneath layers of perfume, now scrubbed the stone floors with plain water, the sound of the mop echoing a new honesty in a quiet meeting of the council members. A gentleman in a faded coat chuckled softly, noting that the city's richest had finally been asked to share the very air they once hoarded. The decree, though stern, carried a gentle humor that settled like dust on the rafters, reminding everyone that even power can be humbled by a simple draft. The following spring, Lady Seraphine turned the courtyard's barren stone into a modest garden, planting rosemary, thyme, and lilac that released their scent without artifice. Children from the nearby lanes gathered to watch the slow unfurling of green shoots, their laughter mixing with the soft rustle of leaves and the distant clink of a far-off tavern's glasses. Citizens strolled along newly opened promenades where open vents allowed the blended aromas of fresh bread, river reeds, and the garden's herbaceous perfume to mingle freely. The council's mandated ventilation shafts, once a symbol of forced compliance, now stood as open arches framing sunlit corridors, their cool drafts offering a gentle relief from the summer heat. In the evenings, lantern light spilled onto the stone benches, and the scent of night blooming jasmine drifted over the gatherings, a shared fragrance that belonged to everyone. As years slipped by, the city's streets kept a steadier breath. The divide between scented privilege and plain odor softened like a watercolor washed in rain. Historians noted that the moment when a privileged house chose to plant a public garden was less a political victory than a quiet acknowledgement that authenticity in scent could be communal. The lingering aroma of lilac in the air reminded passers-by that even the most refined perfume could not hide the underlying human need for honest breath. Lady Seraphine, now often seen tending a modest pot of lavender on a low stool, embodied a humility that the marble statues of the past never knew. In the gentle hush of twilight, the city exhaled a collective sigh, a soft reminder that the most lasting legacy is not the perfume one wears, but the openness with which one lets the world smell.